Good afternoon,
All right.
everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity hosted by the Maine Department of Education. My name is Joe Schmidt. I am the Social Studies Specialist for the department. I am joined today by Jason Anderson, the Visual and Performing Arts Specialist, as well as Shari Templeton, the Science Specialist for the department. We are proud today to host Erin Towns, Social Studies teacher from Edward Little High School in Auburn, Maine today. She is here to give us an interdisciplinary approach where she is addressing social studies, science, and the arts through the lens of polar studies. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to, and one last thing. If you have any questions for Jason, Shari, or myself, we are going to stick around afterwards to give you all three of those perspectives if you want to talk about this as kind of an interdisciplinary approach. So you can ask questions for Erin during the presentation and questions for Jason, Shari, and myself at the end of the presentation. So with that, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Erin Towns.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much. My name is Erin Towns, and thank you all for joining us today. I really, really appreciate you taking some time. I am a social studies teacher from Edward Little High School. I've been teaching there for 21 years. And this year, I was able to start, kind of looking at new ways of doing things. I think COVID was a double-edged sword, and and in that, we were asked to completely restructure what we were doing and how we were doing it. And for a number of reasons, I decided that I was going to take polar studies as the lens. It is directly related to a project that I'll talk about in just a few minutes, and kind of remake and just kind of test out some things. So what I have here is definitely a work in progress. It is, nothing solidified. I know relatively, I was not schooled, as a science educator, nor was I schooled as a visual arts educator. So, some of those things are things that I have learned elsewhere and am going to do my best to pull them in. So if you have any questions, while we go along, please don't hesitate. So I've done a number of global professional development programs. A little bit about my background, really briefly. I was a 2018 National Geographic Grosvenor Teacher Fellow, and more recently 2020 Polar Trek Teacher Program participant. The Polar Trek program matches educators from around the United States with a scientific expedition and research team. It is a competitive application process. And my proposal when I applied was with an interest and emphasis in taking a look at the impact of glacial meltwater in the Arctic on the Gulf of Maine. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later as to why that was my proposal. I was on 7 other professional development global programs around the world. I've served in various volunteer positions around the state. Maine Council for Social Studies, I was a part of for 8 years. I've worked with Joe Schmidt and previously Christy Littlefield of the state, on state DOE programs, curriculum, standards, teacher leadership cohorts. And more recently have started collaborating with Shari and the science division in an effort to bridge the gap between social studies and science education. I served as 7 years, for the past 7 years, I have served as a Camden Conference in the Classroom teacher. This is a program dedicated to bringing more foreign policy into Maine classrooms. And now I serve as their teacher ambassador. There have been various times in my career where, I've worked with geographic information systems at a very basic level. I started a Maine GIS group for interested teachers, and I also did a fair amount of volunteering in the Auburn GIS office with Rosemary Mosier there in Auburn. I've got numerous photography and videography projects relating to geologic history of Maine, geopolitics of the Arctic, and glacial hydrology of the Western Greenland ice sheet, and the impact of meltwater on rising sea levels and that impact that it has environmentally, politically, socially on Maine. These opportunities enabled me to be able to Excuse me. These opportunities enabled me to gain perspectives that I never would have had. I've met teachers from all over the United States and the world. Taking suggestions from others is what I learned was the smart way of doing business and education, and in the classroom. It's ultimately helped me to provide my students with educational opportunities that are directly relevant to their lives in Maine, and then branching out from there to the state, the United States, and the world. None of what you are about to see would have been possible without exploring, education, idea swapping, brainstorming, and willingness to hear other educators, and gain from a lot of these professional development programs. A lot of what you see is adopted from ideas that I have pulled from them, and a lot of it has been modified, for the sake of my own style in classroom audiences. So, as such, I urge you to take these ideas and adopt them to suit your own needs. Everything that you see here, you can feel free to adopt and share and modify to your own style. At the end of it all, it is, and I truly believe this about our students. Yeah. So I really urge you to, if it works for you. Okay, let's see here. All right. Um, this is my kindergarten photo. I am in the top row. I'm the third kid from the right. That's me, and I'm the only kid that is not smiling for the photo. Every single photo that was taken of me during my time looked like this. School was hard for me coming through as a student. My brain as a child did not lend itself well to written words alone. I struggled with things like writing, and also struggled within the industrial model of schooling that I was brought up in. I was the child of Civil War reenactors, however. So performance, firsthand experiences, and visual imagery were the tools that I utilized to understand and comprehend the world around me. Since I began teaching, I used more visuals than any other tools in my teacher toolkit. I used to take photos and transform them into those old transparencies and then put them on those overhead projectors with the heat, like blaring on me. And before computers came into the classroom, about 2000, it was about 2002, 2003 that I got my first desktop classroom computer. I had massive folders that housed, an entire year's worth of curriculum in photographs, and all on those transparencies. So, anyways, and speaking about visuals, I met Joe Schmidt when he came to his position in the DOE Social Studies Division. Joe taught me the value of inquiry. So I always use visuals, but I use them as like examples rather than trying to directly engage students. So one of the things that Joe taught me right off the bat was a very useful strategy when we talk about visuals and we talk about me bringing polar studies into Maine classrooms. Visuals are everything. And so he taught me this, really, really neat trick. And considering we can't do an interactive bit today, I would just explain to you that I will put an image like this up, in my classroom. I will ask students to simply, for 1 minute, they are to write down everything that they see. Sometimes we make it a competition. Sometimes we use multiple photos and we'll rerun it and try to get them to slow down and observe more. I saw a statistic a few years ago now. This is an older statistic, that the average high school, the average number of photographs that a high school student would see, or visual imagery, is about 700 each day. And that's including all of the pictures that they're seeing on, Snapchat, Instagram, movies, Netflix, all social media. So the next minute I will have students kind of, draw a line. I usually have them do all of this by hand, and they'll draw a line, and I'll ask them, what do they think is going on in the image? What do they think it's about? And really kind of push them to take numerous guesses as to what that's about. And I keep really strict time on it, so and then the last minute is dedicated to having them brainstorm as many questions about the photo itself, and depending on the photograph, I can almost, well, not almost, but I can totally manipulate almost what they are going to ask and the points that I want to make by the choice of imagery that I'm using. So here, this is, an image that was taken. I traveled to Puerto Rico recently, and I was doing some, I was out and about, and I was documenting, of course, the after effects of Hurricane Maria. We're taking a look at places that are also way out of the way, in terms of and how they relate to ocean currents, the Gulf of Maine, of course. We always bring it back local. And so this was the photograph that we used, and it led to, a lot of discussions, everything about, what happened to the roof, the vegetation that surrounded it, the materials that were used to build it, what they thought it was. And it really kind of, I've seen since I have used that methodology, it really, really promotes a great deal of rich discussion. And it's a great way to start my classes. So, in terms of, visual imagery, I also want to introduce, like where my learning of science, and my development of my science identity came from. This picture was taken when I was a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow. We were in Glacier Bay National Park, and I was aboard the National Geographic Sea Lion. It was 6 a.m. And it was at this moment that I began developing my science identity. Actually, I was staring at this while I was listening to biologist Larry Hobbs. And he was standing next to me and pointing out all of the features that showed evidence of glacial succession. In an instant, it connected all of the things that I had been taught in a book so long ago, but I never, the, those connections never took place in my brain until that moment, and it sent explosions through my brain. It was right here in this moment that I fully understood the power of visuals and the acquisition and comprehension of knowledge. All right. So having, sort of introduced those, two things, I want to tell you, where do we start with polar studies if I'm going to bring it into my classroom? And my answer to that is in our own backyard. What you see here is a photograph of Portland, Maine, the waterfront, and Eimskip, which is an Icelandic shipping company. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But I start by telling them a little bit about the background and how the Arctic directly connects to Maine. So Maine has numerous important economic and strategic interests in what goes on in the Arctic, even though it does not border it. Portland has hosted the senior Arctic official meeting in 2016. It allowed Maine to highlight its successful pivot towards the north. Senator Angus King became co-chair of the Arctic Caucus in 2015. Maine sent and continues to send a large delegation to the Arctic Circle Assembly every year in Iceland. Maine sends over 50% of its exports to a neighboring Arctic nation of Canada. Maine also struck a deal with Iceland's largest shipping firm, Eimskip, to locate its North American headquarters to Portland. So all of this, indicates that Maine indeed has a vested interest when it comes to a warming climate and the serious implications that it could have, most notably on sea level rise. Maine Governor Janet Mills addressed the Climate Action Summit before the United Nations General Assembly and attended the 2019 Arctic Circle Assembly again. She continues to focus on Arctic issues by collaborating with Arctic countries like Finland and Norway in areas of focus surrounding bioeconomic innovation, forest health, sustainability, and all of this in the face of climate change. Also with an eye on renewable energy technologies and scientific cooperation. So these are all like different areas that when I looked at it, I could actually start to implement in my classroom and start to see and fit them where it would make sense in curriculum. Sea level rise is probably the largest, and sea level rise, of course, in the Gulf of Maine, along with the warming of the Gulf of Maine, which is warming, I believe, warming faster than 99% of the other bodies of water in the world. Sea level rise is projected to affect at least 132 Maine cities and towns, affecting coastal businesses, homes, wildlife habitat, transportation systems, and some of the state's most treasured places, according to an analysis done by the Natural Resources Council of Maine. A 1 meter rise is projected to take out over 20,000 acres. And at the worst case scenario, a 6 meter rise over 127,000 acres. So this sets up why we are, talking about it and why we are discussing it. And I'm going to say to you that as teachers in the state of Maine, it sets up why we should be discussing it in our classrooms. All right. So after I establish, that within my classroom, the next thing that I do is I introduce the tools, of how we're going to look at this and how students are actually going to report back on what they learn. There is a good deal of writing, lots of short response, but really it's the visual tools that we use with a series of assignments. All of you at the end of this are going to get a copy also of this entire presentation that has all of the links, excuse me, at the bottom for some of these resources. And so the very, very first thing that we use it was given to us when we were Grosvenor Teacher Fellows at National Geographic. And it's the National Geographic Guide to Photography. And so right off the bat, we use a visual tool that students are using every single day. And the things, that I've found in students is that they are careless when it comes to, things like composition, framing, editing of any kind, clarity. How do you stop camera shake? Like, really, sorts of things like that. But this guide to photography that includes the photography basics is an absolutely wonderful, very, very easy resource to use. And the lesson that I have it go with, there are two lessons. One of them has students introducing themselves only using images. And they use, like a Google slide or something like that. But the object is to stop this incessant use of things like PowerPoint and all of that, just solely for writing notes, like really, really getting some images that engage students and then allowing them to really think about how they want to introduce their own lives in a really visual way. The second lesson that I go on to do is have them then introduce their communities. So like part of starting in the backyard and especially about, like polar studies is really, kind of having them take a look around as far as what is the evidence, that is out there that links us directly with the Arctic. One of those evidences, we do a lesson, after we're going to introduce our neighborhoods. That's when we kind of start taking a look at the geologic history of Maine. And it's a great place to start because when students think about glaciers, I think they think things are really, really far away. But of course, as you all know, glaciers are very much a part. They're every part of the formulation and shapes of all of the existing landforms that we have around here. So we kind of, lure them in with photos like this, which asks them, like what's going on here, in that same format. And using, using a different type of technology. We use also drone technologies in the classroom. We've started to, kind of implement that. I was introduced to that when I was on the Grosvenor program with a photographer by the name of Sean Nielsen. And we were looking at a glacier and he was talking out loud about wanting a drone so that he could get closer, and I just thought, and that thought stuck with me. And so I wrote up a donors choose site and was able to fundraise. It took me a long time because I did write a number of grants before that that I couldn't quite seem to get. But I was happy when the drone was funded. And what it does is it reinforces, different perspectives, so it teaches students visually how to look at the world from different ways. So let's see. This provided, also an emotional hook because it allowed us to tell the story of a glacial erratic one of the largest in the world that we can find up in Strong, Maine, and this is Daggett Rock. And for anybody that went to the University of Maine at Farmington, or schooled in geography or geology, I'm sure that this is no surprise to you. Um, and so we were able to, tell the story of Daggett, which, pretty much is summed up. Daggett was a woodsman. He was feeling a little down. Business wasn't going real well for him. And so he decided that he was going to drink a bunch of alcohol, and he got hammered, and he decided that he was going to climb up on top of this rock, and he started cursing the gods. And the sky opened up, lightning came down and split the rock into three, and then we talk about, the difference between, like where legends come from as opposed to what science tells us about this, which, the theory goes is that this was picked off of maybe somewhere around Saddleback Mountain, and it came to rest there when the ice sheet was receding. So this lesson, this activity in class and the storytelling about it sends students out into their own communities to document evidence of glaciers in their own cities and towns and regions. So students can opt to go as far out as they want. I do have some students that do not have the ability to travel, and so therefore we take a look at where we can get imagery that is, not copyrighted. Talk about copyrights. We talk about plagiarization. We talk about, giving credit to where credit is due. And they are asked to provide, edited photographic evidence of striations, mountain erosions, glacial erratics, moraines, cirques, lakes, till. And the lesson ends with students, asking students to write historical fiction, about the geologic history of Maine. So we bring the storytelling element into it here. So while I was on again the fellowship with National Geographic, I met this incredible lady. She was the 2018 Grosvenor Teacher Fellow. Her link, and she's also a Polar Trek. She was 2017 Grosvenor Fellow, 2018 Polar Trek teacher, and I've left the link to her expedition, which you can see, which her expedition was about migration and carryover effects in Arctic seabirds. As educators, we want our students to learn new information, remember new information, and connect new information to something else they have learned, and apply and transfer knowledge to other scenarios. This quote is taken right out of her book, which is highlighted here, Visual Note-Taking for Educators. And it is a stellar book. We start with discussing with students how their brains actually work. The history, of people trying to figure it out, like feeling their bumps on skulls, how scientists learn about the brain, the structure of the brain, and then also, Pillars herself, and she goes on and talks about, things like, if 2% of your neurons were to perform and fire at once, you'd pass out from exhaustion, and that kind of stuff, you bring in, and they're just like, whoa. And so it also allows students to see the science behind why they take in perhaps more from a visual, and how a visual can strengthen, studies in visual learning can strengthen what they are already doing. Let's see. All right. So what we bring into our classroom, therefore, is sketchnoting. And sketchnoting allows students, to really kind of take a look at these, big ticket items, and it allows them to, they have to read about it, then they have to decide how they will visually sketch it, and then they have to label it, and then they have to answer questions that go along with it that make up the captions. So at the end of it all, they are going over this information in numerous different ways and having to show, that work in numerous different ways. So this is, just a series on, if we're going to talk about environmental studies in a classroom, they better know the basics of how things work. And by the time they come to me, they have been introduced to all of these things. Sometimes it just is a matter of just refreshing them, and sometimes it's a matter of allowing students to visually connect what's already been established in their brains, and they just haven't realized it yet. Also, the opportunity exists, to really like kind of start to place it with other, you know, other subjects. And this is where the interdisciplinary mode comes in, is taking a look at, like if we talk about classical, ancient history and classical history, and we can link it with ancient China and classical China, to kind of get a feel for what types of tools are where, how people were using their geography, and what they were using it for, rather than just this is where this is, and these are the flags that belong there, and this is the food that they eat. It really, kind of takes that analysis up to another level. One of the most popular, they love it every single year. They love it. I don't know if you have seen, it was a National Geographic series. It used to be on Netflix. I believe it's on Disney Plus now. It's called One Strange Rock. It's narrated by Will Smith. The kids eat it up. We watch episode 1 and episode 10. And episode 1, introduces them to the life of a diatom, and it really does a stellar job. The series does a stellar job in explaining how interconnected all of the Earth systems are by taking a look at this one specific, subject. So it's done really well. It's also told from the perspective of astronauts. So you have this really like unique, like storytelling method that gets kids like right into it. It also introduces women in science, because the most, traveled astronaut is a woman. So it's just a really cool idea. The centerpiece here is also another take on geography. We do a lot of maps in my room. They're not usually like, hugely like detailed, or haven't been in years past, but we started the beginning of the year with, a general sketch. And what we decided to do is, instead of doing the world like I always did, like sketch all the continents and then add the rivers, we decided to do it from the polar perspective, which really flipped their perspective, like upside down. And along with that, what you see here are the 8 Arctic nations. And then you see in the center, where the North Pole is, all of the different claims, the Arctic claims. So here we start to pull in and introduce them to topics like geopolitics, which is, something that's not generally spoken about in a lot of curriculums. I think it's addressed, if there are curriculums with, let's say, climate sciences and climate policy. We had a woman at Edward Little, a teacher, phenomenal teacher. Her name's Jennifer Johnson, and she ran a course that was called The End of the World, and it was all about climate policy. And and it's in courses like these that geopolitical topics really come in handy. The last one that you see here is actually a brainstorm on action, and it's also, aside from knowledge, we want to get kids to act. So that was the result of being able to kind of get students brainstorming about different ideas of what they could do with the information later. All right, are there any questions so far? Okay, so storytelling, at the bottom of this slide, when you get it, there is a resource for National Geographic for the elements of storytelling, and then another resource for National Geographic, the power of images in storytelling. And for those of you that have never seen these pictures, it's sort of a travesty. Well, not sort of, it is a travesty. This is Matthew Alexander Henson. He was born in 1866 to a family of freeborn sharecroppers in Maryland. It was 1 year after emancipation and the end of the Civil War. He is an African American of the first generation to roam the world after the abolition of slavery. He led a singular life of exploration and discovery, and he was in great part of ushering in the modern era of adventure that continues now through the 21st century. At 12, he became a cabin boy. He later received an education skills. He became a competent sailor and he started traveling the world. One day he was working in a shop down in the DC area, and in came walking Maine's own Robert Perry. Robert um, was taken aback at first, as he writes, but then also just extremely impressed with the knowledge and the skill set that Henson possessed. So he hired him as a personal assistant, and they went to Nicaragua at the time, and they were exploring the possibility of building a canal connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. So in 1891, after working together with that, they began their 18-year partnership, exploring the Arctic and trying to locate the North Pole. During some of those, they found like the largest iron meteorite ever transported to humans at 31 metric tons. These guys transported it out of the Arctic. He was addressed, he was very knowledgeable with Inuit culture. He spoke the language fluently. He was addressed as Matthew the Kind One by Inuit peoples that he encountered. Mad skills, master carpenter building. He maintained all sledges and built all sledges that they used. Henson led the first group of sledges towards the North Pole on March 1st, 1909. And for the next 5 weeks, all of the teams were racing towards their goals. The party reached the North Pole, but questions remained who had arrived there first. And I quote him when I say, I was in the lead that had overshot the mark by a couple of miles. And he was quoted in a newspaper article saying that upon their return. We went back, and then I could see that my footprints were the first at the spot. The next part of the story is a great way of bringing in topics, including African-American history and studies about racism in American history. So the racially divisive climate of the time would not give an African-American man the same standing in the public eye for the accomplishment of such a monumental feat of human achievement. So Perry was recognized as the discoverer of the poles, while Henson was relegated to the role of, somewhat of a trusty companion. So we can discuss overwhelming imagery of the world explorers that depict only white men, history, a history of racism and race relations in the United States, storytelling, narratives. This is what these types of images can start us taking a look at, and the story that goes behind them. Other ways, that we do that. This is a Sami artist. The Sami peoples are a Scandinavian peoples, and she stands near her art piece of 400 reindeer skulls. So we start talking about environmental protest, and the ways in which indigenous nations are trying to engage policymakers and bring a lot of publicity in. They're doing it through huge art installations such as this. She's got 400 reindeer skulls hanging in front of the Parliament building. The reason being is those 400 skulls belonged to her brother, and the Norwegian government had hired a bunch of sharpshooters to go and try to control the reindeer populations. And if we talk to people that lived in that area, or you read, like a lot of their writing, they're finding it very hard to sustain their traditional ways of life when policies like this are being administered. So students, with something like this are, introduced to concepts surrounding the role of film and photography in protest of modern contemporary issues involving indigenous Arctic peoples. And, the way that I would also do that is connecting it to Maine Wabanaki studies, and the history of protest there, especially during the 1970s. Ooh, scientific modeling. This has been a hard one for me. There's a great course online. National Geographic Education provides free courses for all teachers who want to do it. I picked this up when I enrolled in their using models to make predictions. And scientific modeling can assist students in being able to critically think about future choices in visual ways. It's a very interactive tool as well. This is the Concord Consortium. It allows students to change, a bunch of different, components that allows them to, start making predictions, like later on. And then the model of geopolitics, there's also a link for Modelinsky's model of world leadership. And it's not capable of predicting events, but it's an interesting link, to scientific modeling is that it's a historical model and it interprets historical data in a really simplified framework. So in other words, it is a descriptive model and it's one that we are testing out. Although I have not been hugely successful with that yet, we're going to try it again. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. All right, just gonna go through these last couple. We use GIS systems, and there's a great lesson from National Geographic Education, which is Introduction to GIS for students in the classroom. Has them using things like yarn and maps, and they have to make an outline of the United States without taking a look at the map at first, and then and they have to work collaboratively to do that. It gets students up and around and thinking, and it's a real at the high school level. It can be an opportunity to talk about team and behavior and expectations of how you work as a team together. It allows them to explore the basic components, like polygons, points, so it's great. This right here also allows students, to take a look at, different points in Maine that are collecting information. This can be found on the Gulf of Maine Institute and the College of the Atlantic websites, both organizations which are excellent. Both organizations that do a tremendous amount of outreach when it comes to the Gulf of Maine. I know that I have talked to a number of educators across the state who do teach oceanography courses, and I would say that the majority of them that I've spoken to, and that's not to say that they're not doing it, but a lot of them have not thought about yet bringing in the Gulf of Maine. And it seems like that would probably be a great place to start, because what I found is that the students can put their head around that, like they know where it is, they've been in it, for the most part. And yeah, I like GIS systems because you can also, students can build their own. There's ArcGIS offers educators free accounts and the ability to start working with GIS and building story maps, which are an interesting and very visual way of using data and telling a story with that data. And I would say that the last resource that we use a lot in terms of, especially when we talk about geopolitics, is the Observatory of Economic Complexity. This was I think it was a master's thesis that was done by some MIT students. And it's a really visual way of students being able to study economic data, and geopolitics. Again, two subjects that can be, create a bit of confusion. In the old days, it was like the CIA World Fact Book, and you'd have to find out what the percentages were. And, it's these like endless sheets of paper. This right here is a really visual way of students being able to pull up, and these are Greenland's largest export partners, and it can tell you, percentages. If we look along the bottom right here, it can also change it up. And so you can take a look at the actual products that they are trading out, and then, with whatever area of the world they are trading with. Students are able to assess a lot in a really small amount of time and start making connections and answering questions relating to why certain countries cooperate or block cooperation depending on region and what is going on. It's an incredible resource. It helps explain some things about geopolitical considerations that countries vying for territory and business in the Arctic might have in mind. And the way that I would extend that, is also if I'm teaching a science class, perhaps a nod, to those geopolitical considerations and then the impact that, whatever they are going for or whatever they are doing, whether it's drilling, whatever it is, shipping route fights, that you can take a look at the environmental implications of these moves. Um, Lastly, this is my classroom, and it allowed just a really really simple way of explaining, the differences. It's climate change and rising seas. So we were discussing the difference between melting sea ice and melting land ice with this activity. Another one from National Geographic. It's minimal prep. It helps students to understand their world in simplified and visual ways. They had a blast doing it. They were taking clay and they had to create in each one of those tubs, something that would represent what the Maine coast actually looks like. So they had to have features made out of clay, that were specific to that. They had to they took push pins and they put them in, like near the coastal, like area of their creation. So those represented structures. It could have been buildings, whatever they wanted. And then of course they filled, both with water, and one, with the ice in the water, and the other one with the ice above. And it was just like a really neat activity, and it allowed them to create tables and collect data in a really, really simple way. For me, as a social studies educator, I don't have time for an in-depth process to be set up. So this was a one-shot deal. It was very, very easy to do. And it helped illustrate a concept for them that, albeit it is very basic, it was still really fun and solidified further in their brains, the impact of melting ice off of glaciers on rising sea levels. So the last two slides that I have for you today are a couple of resources that, if you yourself don't know a lot about the Arctic, and especially in areas surrounding geopolitics and science, the Camden Conference every year is a foreign policy conference that for the past 30 years has been putting on conferences, and they are related to a number of different topics. You can find video collections of almost every single conference that they've had, spanning back years and years. Their topic this year, oddly enough, was the geopolitics of the Arctic, and so perfect timing. But you have all of these great video resources that you can watch. Each one of these presentations is led by leading scientists, politicians. We have the former premier of Iceland up here, and it just allows, they're good to use in the classroom, like maybe not the whole presentation, but it's explained in a really clear, straightforward way, because it's presented for audiences that aren't necessarily glaciologists or environmentalists, like they're just they're individuals from across the state of Maine, high school students all the way up to people in their 80s and 90s, so I found that to be great. And the last thing are the research guides that are put out by the Library of Congress. And these research guides are a host of different primary sources. So you get to hear from the explorers themselves, and it's got their data records and stories and, logs. And sometimes I'll start with just, a piece of writing, and this is great for like US history classes, even like environmental science classes. Like, this is a great interdisciplinary tool, and that harnesses the power of the primary resource and perspective and viewpoint. Everything from Teddy Roosevelt, his writings about the Arctic are in there. It's just an incredible wealth of knowledge. So that's all I have for you today. It's again a start. This year I was graced with being able to have an entire course that I could implement the entire course this year, and I could run the course twice this year, even though in a short amount of time. Next year, that's not going to be the case, I don't believe. And so therefore, I was really appreciative, because it's also expanded my mind as to how I can fit it in other areas and other things that I teach in really, really unique ways. So I hope I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And if there are any questions, I kind of left the end for questions for you guys.
Does anybody have any questions for Erin? And I guess at this time we can also say if there's any questions for myself, Shari, or Jason as well. I can either, if you're okay being on screen recorded, I can invite you to have your video on, or you can
Sure,
use the chat
that'd be great.
box as
Then I can
well.
see people. It's so can't see.
I will leave that up to the participants if they are interested in that, or if there's any questions. It's fine with that. Okay.
I have a question for you, Erin.
Sure. Hi, Diana. How are you?
I'm wondering how you get students to give you more than just obvious things off the top of their head when they see it. I mean, what kind of questions do you ask students when you're looking at a photograph or a piece of art to really get them to think more deeply about what they're seeing?
A lot of it is really just like pushing them. It's a lot of push, sometimes if I will use that quadrant, strategy. Joe taught me that, where we break down, different corners of the piece of art or the photograph. And they literally, I'm like, if you don't have 10 things written down here, we're all done, like you're all done. Sometimes I make it a competition. Like they love a competition. So I'll be like, okay, I think that I'm about to win this right now, and kind of challenge them a little bit, and you wouldn't believe what it does. They're like, no, you won't, it's like, okay, so that's sort of a fun way, for engagement. Generally, also, it's the type of photograph that I'm using, it's not going to be, I don't want to use, like an obvious photo. I look for photographs, that has something to do with the topic that I want to talk about, and really to like kind of get them, like they're like, what is that? And we try to figure it out. So those are some of the ways.
If I could, Erin, I just want to interject a little bit too. I'm glad you spoke to that second point, because oftentimes when I know visual art teachers are making connections with other content areas and they're using photography, when you talk a lot about the composition of the photograph, there's a lot of depth there to be explored, that it's not simply the superficial, what is the image showing you? It's starting to tip the image on its side, proverbially, right? And look at the depth of it, and why did the artist make the composition of this photo out to be what it is? Where's the light directed? What's the subject of this photo? And that really can add to probing students for deeper knowledge on that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and I had not done that yet. I had not even thought to do that. Like from a social studies point of view, like we're mainly looking at that. So I appreciate those. I'll tell you what, we're doing it tomorrow.
Other questions from either Diana or there's other attendees I can bring you into the scene as well.
I have another question. How do you get students to steer away from stereotypes when they're looking at a photograph, and evaluating it from their cultural perspective, rather than being a little more open-minded?
I think that that's just giving them freedom, like within that, whatever they are brainstorming off the top of their head, and then that can open up, for discussions, certainly enrich discussions within the classroom, and I think it's just establishing a very, very safe sort of environment for students to have those discussions to begin with, and the ability, to talk about and we introduce a lot about stereotypes right off the bat, in every social studies class that we teach, and also really kind of teaching more about, the more content that you have in your classroom about Indigenous peoples and African American history and Wabanaki culture and government and politics and art, you know, like then it's the norm, you know, and it's not the add-on, you know. So that for me is just my personal philosophy and how I establish that in my classroom.
Last call, and any questions for either Erin specifically or Shari, Jason, or myself? Feel free to either put it into the chat. Diane is in the room here with us. I can also bring any of the other attendees into the room if you'd like to ask directly.
I have another question, Erin. Are most of your photographs that you share more landscape based, or do you tend to also choose pictures of maybe important events in history?
I use a real mix now. They used to be more like events and people, you know, like throughout history and how those were depicted. But now, you know, because I am taking a look and as a photographer myself in, you know, in my outside teacher life, photography has enabled me, and I'm fairly new to photography. I've only been doing it professionally for maybe a year and a half, and I always loved it. But it's enabled me to really like kind of explore the world, you know, and to really get to know a lot about Maine geology and glaciology and history, geologic history. Like those are not topics, you know, they were introduced to me when I was at UMF in a really great ways, you know, but they didn't connect for me. I didn't have an interest in that, you know. So certainly now it is a wide mix of things, you know. And I think it's also in the way that I structure the whole course is not just taking a look at just environment, you know. We take a look at the social through the environmental lens, the political lens, an economic lens, and a social lens, you know, and not necessarily in that, or, you know, we go between orders and things, but if you have all four of those lenses, you know, that are structured within that, you know, whatever you're teaching, I think it comes in handy. And I think that over the past handful of years, I think National Geographic, that Grosvenor Fellowship really was fundamental in teaching me as a social studies educator how to do that, you know, in a visual way and bring in and really uplift the teaching of geography and environmental sciences within the classroom. I previously had not done that. You know, like one of, I mean, for example, the other day we were talking about the contemporary issue of government as it stands right now in Iraq, you know, and just taking a look at, you know, one of the topics that we discussed was the role of geography in the formulation of national character. You know, like that's not something that I was doing, you know, a handful of years ago. And, you know, it's really interesting, you know, to see that and to talk about that at a deeper level.
One last call on any questions for Erin, Shari, Jason, or myself.
Erin, you indicated to the panel, I'm sorry, not to the panelists, to the attendees that they would receive access to the slides.
Yes.
With the resources.
Yeah, so, yep, I can send them to all three of you, and then you could, I don't know, what do you want me to do?
If at the very least, Erin, if you send it to me, it will get posted in the professional learning page right next to your webinar.
Perfect, and then I'll do that. I've also included, you know, because I did briefly mention some of the fellowships that I was on. I've done Teachers for Global Classrooms, a number of Fulbright programs, summer seminars, this kind of stuff. That this presentation has all of the links to, those programs and application materials. And if anybody in here is interested in applying or you have questions about it, just send me an email and I'll be more than happy to discuss it with you. And they do accept, by the way, for all of those programs, science teachers, visual arts teachers. It doesn't matter what you teach, so yeah, it's cool. All interdisciplinary.
All right, at this point then, we are at 5 o'clock and I do not see any more additional questions. So thank you, Erin, again, for sharing your expertise and probably more important, your passion for this work. It's always evident, and for giving up an hour of your time and sharing with us again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks to all who participated. I appreciate it. Thank you.